Top of the morning to you. Yay! I have Irish in me. And unfortunately, we didn't notify the kitchen soon enough that I wanted to have something green. We didn't get anything green, so I wore green. So yeah, welcome on this really beautifully sunny St. Patrick's Day. Once again, the Ronald Reagan Building confounded at least two of our speakers who, of course, promptly walked in here and got lost, which my apologies. It's a crazy building. But yeah, I'm glad everyone made it in one piece. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Wilson Center. We're starting my 11th year, everybody. The China Environment Forum has been around for almost 13 years now. It's a project which is, I think, kind of unique here among the can you say kind of unique? No, it is unique, not kind of. There's no such thing as kind of unique. It is unique at the Wilson Center in that it focuses on one country and one issue writ large. Focus on China and environmental issues. And environment, of course, encompasses energy. Happily, the Blue Moon Fund, Rockefeller Brother Fund, USAID, and Vermont Law School have given us support to really dig a lot deeper into the energy and climate issues in U.S.-China relations, a rather important topic by all accounts. So I've been inviting many more of the energy gurus in my network and finding new ones, as today's panel will show. In fact, I'm thinking they're all new. Well, John Guy in the middle from EPA, he's come to our meetings before, so he's kind of been a mafia member for a while in our network. But we've got new folks here. And today, well, in the past 6 months, we've been doing a fair number of meetings, having a lot of U.S. NGOs and businesses coming and talking about either just general energy trends in China, energy efficiency, how projects to build the capacity of Chinese businesses or policymakers in the area of low-carbon economy stuff. Now, today we're kind of switching the focus a bit in that we're going to look at climate, U.S.-China climate relations, and specifically focusing on the co-benefits of reducing black carbon. And I'm a very lucky person because I have three very intelligent people up here who I am only giving them 20 minutes to share a little bit of their wisdom. But then we will have an hour for all of you to ask tough questions of them. They seem like a pretty hardy lot. They survived finding us here in the Ronald Reagan Building. The first speaker is Dr. Ramanathan, who I think most of you know. You have the bio. Can't read it all. I had to shorten your bio. You've got such rich experience. Most of you must know that he is probably one of the world's leading climate scientists. He's a distinguished professor of atmospheric and climate sciences at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California in San Diego. You know that he's made phenomenal discoveries in the climate realm, things from discovering the greenhouse effect of CFCs to the environmental impact of the Asian brown cloud, and also figuring out that the black carbon in the Asian brown cloud was having a warming effect in the Asian region, and probably the main driver of the melting of the glaciers, the Himalayan and Tibetan glaciers. Of course, being from its inception, you've been part of the IPCC. Yep, I want to make sure I got that right. And that, of course, all of you in this room know that IPCC won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And he testified on the Hill yesterday, made quite a splash talking about black carbon. And he's going to start us off today talking a little bit about U.S.-China climate relations and some of the trends, and then diving into black carbon, which is a topic that, I don't know, I mean, I did discover that there are some black carbon experts who I think kind of moseyed on in today, but I fancy a lot of us in the room are not necessarily fluent in black carbon. And I think this could be highly insightful. Next, we have another scientist, John Guy, who is the acting deputy director of EPA's Transportation and Regional Programs Division in Washington, D.C. Now, he's been involved in the implementation of EPA's mobile source rules for over 30 years and has done a lot of work in the United States for implementing engine-based emission requirements, and also has gone to China to help them with some of their own diesel retrofit type programs. And very kindly, and I really want to acknowledge this, that Dale Everts, our EPA air guy from North Carolina, he got that flu. I'm going to have to ask him if he got his shot. But he got sick, and John graciously has stepped in and, took some of Dale's slides, but also added some of his own to talk about what the EPA has been doing on the traditional air pollutant work in China. And some of this does link to black carbon. But what I think is really important in EPA's work, and we've had some of the folks in previous years here at our forum to talk about this, about linking the pollution and health co-benefits, that controlling the pollution beneficial to health. And the Chinese have really grabbed some of this stuff and they've run with it. The third speaker is not a scientist, but he is purported to hang out with them fairly often. We've got Dennis Clare, who's the Senior Law Fellow at the Institute of Governance and Sustainable Development here you're in New York, but their organization's based here in D.C. He focuses on international climate policy. So he's got a background in both domestic and international climate issues. And he's going to be talking. It's funny, when I asked him to come, he was the last speaker, says, I will fill in all the gaps. I'm like, okay, so he's the gap filler here. But but more than that, you have a reason. You're going to be talking about the black carbon, and also about where China might fit in and some of the black carbon type policy negotiations and fora. So he's the man for you here. I'm going to be zipping it up right now, and I'm going to invite Ram to kick it off here. Okay? Thank you very much, everyone.
Should I just sit down and lecture or stand up?
It's up to you. If you want to stand, because we're webcasting, you can hold a mic.
Okay. Yeah.
Let's hold a mic. You're like me. You like moving around.
That's right. Thank you. Jennifer, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. What I thought I'll do is first give, take a few minutes to give an overall perspective of the climate change issue, and then sort of see where does black carbon fit in there, and also why is U.S., India, China, hopefully collaboration would get things moving along. So we all know the various sources of pollution, the smokestacks, and then automobiles, biomass burning, agriculture, and the thing I'm focusing on is quite a bit now is the indoor cooking with biofuels. What does it contribute to climate change? It turns out it's a large issue, sort of intersecting between climate change, development, poverty, etc., etc. So I think there's one thing we need to understand. We've been talking about greenhouse gases, climate change, and then we've been talking about air pollution, right? We used to think of them as two separate bees, but it turns out they're strongly interconnected. Black carbon is one of the things which links air pollution into climate change. There are also other things, okay? So when you don't see anything coming out of your, oh, sorry. I got hopelessly mixed up. Yeah. What you see is particulates, air pollution. What you don't see is gases coming out. So it's the greenhouse gases which you don't see is what causes global warming. Okay, so we have to keep that distinction. So the question is, let's ask, why should someone sitting in India in a rural village worry about what cars we are driving? And likewise, why should we worry about how is food being prepared? We sitting in the U.S. So take a close look at the movie next, which sort of shows how air particles move around. So the clock is ticking here. So all it takes is a matter of 3 to 4, 5 days for air carrying all the things, including pollutants, to cross the Pacific Ocean and move into U.S. In fact, I have had aircraft. I'm an experimentalist by what I do. So we have looked at aircraft and followed Chinese air pollution coming across the U.S. Okay? And we also taken a Gulf aircraft and followed dust and pollution plumes all the way across the Pacific. So while the Chinese are sending their gift to us in a matter of 4 or 5 days, we are sending our gift across the Atlantic to our European colleagues. It takes a lot shorter. It just takes 2 or 3 days. Okay? And while, so you can see, it's like the soap opera As the World Turns. So, Europeans sending their gift back to the Asians, so on and so forth. And look at how fast air from Amazon, carrying all the forest fires, dive into the Antarctic. So the main message I get from this, I'm a atmospheric scientist by training, but the main message I get is we're not going to solve this problem by pointing fingers at each other. Okay? So it's going to take tremendous amount of international collaboration. It also shows why Americans, we should worry about how China manages its air pollution. Okay? So, for example, a student of mine, Odell, who graduated, she showed in California, a kilometer above our head, 75 to 80% of the black carbon is transported from China. Yeah, sorry. So, going back to the Copenhagen Accord, I don't know how many of you have read that. It says we should limit the global warming not to exceed 2 degrees. And that's a huge problem, because I just published this paper that we have already put enough greenhouse gases to warm the planet more than 2 degrees. Okay? So let me give you a background of what is greenhouse gases. So you saw how the air travels around. And some of these gases, like carbon dioxide, once you put them up in the air, they stay there for 100 years to 1,000 years. So you can think of these gases surrounding the planet like a blanket. Okay? So just like a planet keeps us warm on a cold winter night by trapping the body heat, these gases trap the infrared heat coming from the planet. So there's no controversy here. There shouldn't be any confusion. Very simple, elegant physics. Again, it's been measured. I myself have measured this heat flow. So we know how to measure them. So we have trapped enough heat, and we know how much we have trapped. It's close to 1,500 terawatts. Why is that such a large number? The energy consumption by the planet, all developing nations put together, is only 15 terawatts. So we have trapped 100 times more heat. Okay, so the question is not, should we see the warming? Why is the warming not as large as it should have been? And it turns out that's what, if you believe our climate models, if you believe our IPCC, we should have heated the planet more than 2 degrees. But we have seen only about a third of it, okay, about 0.8 degrees. And scientists have shown if you are in this regime of 2 to 4 degree global warming, several climate tipping points, one by one, they will start falling. Okay, we already know the Arctic sea ice has retreated by 30%. So the question is, why have we not seen it? And it turns out that's a work many have been doing, including myself, last 10 years, that air pollution, you saw those smokestack. When you see things with your eye, what it means is it's reflecting sunlight. So on this blanket, we have put mirrors on the blanket, and they bounce the sunlight back and sort of masked about 50% of the warming. Okay, the main culprit of this mirrors is sulfates and nitrates, and we will see how, as in the West, we are ramping down the sulfur. We are sort of cleaning off the mirrors, thanks to our air pollution laws, because you need to get rid of the sulfates that contributes to acid rain and all kinds of health impacts. But what the EPAs of the world have not realized is that as they are cleaning up, they are inadvertently removing this mask so that we can see the full greenhouse beast, which we have not seen. Half of it is just hidden under these mirrors. Okay? So it's sort of a perplexing new thing. Here I'm showing, so that's the observed warming. Okay, this is surface temperature record. Honestly, I've not understood what the source of the controversy in the media and the press about, oh, this warming is all a hoax. These are temperature records. Any one of you can download it from websites and plot it. Okay? So it shows since the early part of 19th century, there's been a steady warming, but fits and bursts. Okay? So I don't want to go through all this. This is what our models say. If I input all of the pollution changes, we are able to follow this record. Okay? But if I remove the mask, if we had not by sheer dumb luck, as we were thickening the blanket, putting these mirrors, that's the warming we should have seen. So it's sort of a Faustian bargain. You can say, wow, that's good. So the air pollution has helped. The way I look at it is, had we not had these mirrors, we would have already seen a degree warming by now, and we would have started all the regulations. Okay? If the planet had warmed by a degree, I don't think any one of us would be arguing who is doing what to whom. So now, we are already committed the planet to more than 2-degree warming. What are we doing now? That's our CO2 emissions. Okay? And I think I use the unit of carbon, but the policymakers use CO2. So really, we are putting about 35 billion tons of carbon dioxide every year. Okay? And so that's the emission increase, how it has increased. This is the concentration. Okay? The pre-industrial concentration is 280. So we already put about 100 parts per million in our units. That's close to 880 gigatons, billion tons of carbon dioxide we have put. Just converting into units we can understand. That's about 440 billion Toyota cars with the accelerator stuck and circulating on the planet. Okay? Just imagine the sheer weight of what we have put. There are people who claim, technologists, oh, we can suck the CO2 out of the air. We have to figure out where are we going to put 440 billion cars. Okay? On top of that, we are adding, okay, now the emission is going up by 2-3%. So I'm assuming that by 2015, in another 5 years, hopefully due to Copenhagen Accord, we will start ramping down the CO2 emissions. We can talk during the discussion how we can do that. So let's say if it starts coming down, and because President Obama wants the emission to be cut by 50% by 2050, including the EU, they're all pushing for it. The interesting thing is, even if you do that, the CO2 concentration is still going to keep increasing because of the lifetime, right? We are putting 35 billion tons. Even if we cut it by 50%, you're still going to be putting 17 billion tons of CO2. So what we are doing is the blanket is thickening at a fast rate, but because of the Copenhagen Accord, hopefully we'll slow down the rate at which that blanket is thickening. We are never going to be able to thin it to cut the warming to less than 2 degrees. Okay? So what that means is that we'll be adding another 80 parts per million, close to about 400 billion tons. There are already 880 billion tons. We'll be adding another 500 billion tons, and hopefully stabilize the carbon dioxide concentration to about 430 ppm. In that case, then we'll be adding another degree warming. Okay? We already put 2.5, but we are not seeing it because of the mask. So the mask, because of the mask, we are making the blanket thicker. Okay? So even to cut 50%, that's what I'm assuming in my scenarios, let's not downplay how Herculean task that is. This is a projection by the International Energy Agency. If we don't do anything, so we will merrily go along this path. By 2050, we'd be putting 62 billion tons. To cut it to 50%, you have to bring it to this, where we are putting only 15 gigatons. Okay? The cost estimated to do that is $46 trillion over the next 40 years. Okay? So, no wonder there's tremendous opposition and objection from the industry. It's not a simple, trivial task. So that's the CO2 story. So that's the Copenhagen Accord. And I think the thing I love the most about this is all the leaders have agreed that climate change is one of the greatest challenges of time. So, I've been in this field for 35 years. And some of you have started working on this last 5 years don't probably realize what a significant thing that is. So I go to talks like this, I don't have to start justifying why climate change is important. Okay? So to me, it's a big start. It's a fantastic start. And they agree that the global temperature should be below 2 degrees. So where is the other part of the story? So far I painted a hopeless picture, but fortunately there is a hope. And that hope is, in addition to putting carbon dioxide, we've been putting other greenhouse gases. One is ozone. It is treated as air pollutant by the EPAs of the world, which is, and methane, natural gas. It leaks. It also comes from waste, dumps, and agriculture. Cows and rice paddies are major source of methane. Halocarbon. This was used as refrigerant, etc. So together, these guys have contributed as much as 70% of CO2, and then comes black carbon. Okay, what is black carbon? Basically the black stuff you see coming out of diesel trucks and fires. Okay? And so now going back to my blanket, so we have blanket, we have the mirrors, which is sulfates, but there is also smoke in the blanket. That's the black carbon. Okay? And that black carbon is the most strongest absorber of sunlight. That's why smoke looks black or blackish. Okay? And the modelers estimate 27. My own estimate using observations about 55. Slowly the modelers are coming towards my value. Okay? Give them another year or two to fix their things. But in any case, independent of what you use, the total non-CO2 contribution to global warming is 97% to 125%. So in this blanket, we got other gases which are thickening the blanket. The beauty of them is they are short-lived. What do I mean short-lived? If we institute policies today to cut down ozone precursors, ozone is not produced by human beings, but we put gases, carbon monoxide, methane, NOx, volatile organics, they produce ozone. The policies you take today, ozone will, my lifetime is only a month, so it will disappear a few months from now. So in other words, we can immediately thin the blanket. It's not like the CO2. You do something today, it'll take 100 years for it to respond. Okay? So the response would be immediate. Take black carbon. We have diesel particulate filters, which filters out 99%, 90% of the black carbon. So hopefully I wanted to report to you in yesterday's hearing what I found really rejuvenating is that both the Democrat side and the Republican side, ranking member Sensenbrenner, was supportive of reducing black carbon. So if we take laws to regulate black carbon, they'll be gone a few weeks from now. So you'll get immediate response. You can immediately wipe out about 25% of that warming commitment. Okay? So that's mainly the advantage. So what is black carbon? We have tremendous amount of observational evidence. It's a global problem. I'm just showing India because my focus has been looking at the pollution. You can see how a river of pollution just going over, filling the whole country. Okay? And so this is black carbon. This basically, I had made these measurements with aircraft filling the North Indian Ocean, the Arabian Sea. We had to go about 3,000 kilometers away from the source in Diego Garcia, Southern Indian Ocean, to be rid of this. Okay? And this shows from satellite how the black carbon surrounds the Himalayas, both from the Chinese side and from the Indian side. It's a 3-kilometer thick, dense plume, trapping enormous amount of sunlight, heating the air, and then warming the Himalayan Tibetan region. Okay? So now this gives you a global picture of the black carbon. So think of the blanket, and this blanket has been made patchy by black carbon. The reason it's patchy is its lifetime is a few weeks. So you can see the massive dense heating of the air over China, and also the mirrors causes the reflection, so dimming at the surface, cuts off sunlight at the ground. You can see this reduction is about 10-15 times larger than the greenhouse forcing of CO2. So locally and regionally, these pollutants have a huge impact, and that's why China should and does care about air pollution. Okay? So what is the Chinese sensitivity to the extent I've talked to the scientists, with the government, is that's the Himalayan Tibetan glaciers, okay, feeding the rivers both in India, Southeast Asia, and China. In fact, the famous river Brahmaputra, which starts from the glaciers on the Chinese side and flows across India and Bangladesh, they're already starting to put dams there to divert some of the water. So it's going to be a huge issue, water. And the Chinese finally, I think they've already recognized black carbon is the huge issue. They've published reports about glacial retreat, and India is still catching up to it. They're realizing it's a problem. And of course, you all heard about the recent controversy. So the issue is, what's interesting is, some of the 2 or 3 papers just published in the last few months, the Chinese scientists are pointing out, oh, all the black carbon is coming from Europe and India. So it's already the transboundary, transcontinental debates have started. Okay? So why should China again care about climate change? This is one of the biggest problems. This is the rainfall trend over the last 50 years. And here you see red means precipitation has decreased and drying. And when we published this, about 5 years ago. There's a lot of resistance from the Indian meteor scientists. Oh, it's part of natural variability, it's nothing. Now they're realizing there are papers coming from Indian scientists talking about something strange is happening to the monsoon. You can't explain this decrease from greenhouse gases. You have to bring in particulates. Why? Because these mirrors cut off the sunlight, and you need sunlight to evaporate moisture from the ocean. What goes up, falls down, comes as rainfall. Okay? And the China side, the biggest issue is northern China is drying out, it's well known, and southern China is getting flooded. So the rainfall is reshifting. And also there are papers to show sunlight has gone down enormously in the northeast China, and cloudiness has decreased. So they know climate is changing, and they know they can't explain all of it from greenhouse warming. There is something else. Okay, that something else is the mirrors and the smoke. So this, I'm touching a little bit about going back to the so-called blame game. Okay, this is the CO2 emission from India, US, but 4 times large. And China, as you know, is going through the roof, caught up with the US and gone past. This is their annual emissions at Western Europe. But we have to be careful about CO2. The CO2 effect is from cumulative emission over the last 100 years, the rate of thickening of the blanket. So if you look at in that part, then the major contribution is really from developed nations, US and Europe, because they've been accumulating over the last 50, 100 years. Whereas you can see China's and India's just started in the last 20 years. Okay? So their local, if you look at India's contribution, it's about 4% to this 880 tons. Remember, we are putting 35 tons every year, but there is already about 890 tons. Okay? The contribution to those 890 tons mainly comes from the developed nations. But if you look at the next 50 years, China and India would take over the thickness. That's the issue we are facing. Okay? So that's again go back to we have to solve this problem together, and that was why I was delighted when Jennifer invited me, and hopefully this forum would take up this issue. This shows the black carbon emission, okay, from various countries. This unit is teragrams, or think of this 1 means 1 million tons. So the beauty here is the CO2 is in billions of tons, 35 billion tons, whereas the black carbon is in million tons. So 1 ton of black carbon has the same effect as 1,000 tons of CO2. All right? So if we can figure out how to suck up the black carbon, we can solve the problem. Right? So part of the problem, sorry. So if you look at the emissions, of course, China is the biggest emitter of black carbon. And they know that. And they are interested in controlling it because if it's a huge air pollutant, it causes deaths, over 1.5 million in Asia alone. It basically, forget about all this, the sky looks awful because of the black carbon. Okay? And you know how much China did to improve that during the Beijing Olympics. But you look at the per capita, I was surprised when I plotted this. US is still the leader. We used to think of black carbon as a poor man's pollution. Maybe given our economy, it is a poor man's pollution. But so we have some ways to go too. In fact, maybe Dennis will talk about it, somebody will talk about it. Models have suggested 50% of the Arctic sea ice retreat is coming from black carbon. Because when black carbon falls on the snow, it darkens it. The reason snow is white is it reflects 80% of the sunlight. So it doesn't take too much black carbon to make the snow dirty. Okay? So there is push now to cut down black carbon emission from the Arctic countries to slow down the sea ice retreat. And for China and India, it's an issue of the glaciers. Okay? The Himalayan glaciers. So now what's happening, I'm pleased to see a distinguished scientist from EPA is here. I'm going to point finger at the EPA. But these are where I think I'm so happy now. The EPA and the Energy Department all gotten together now on the climate issue. Okay, so that we wouldn't do inadvertent hurt to the environment. So this is our sulfur emission, okay, from coal combustion. These are the mirrors. You can see that since the 80s, because of concern for air pollution and for acid rain, SO2 emission has rapidly come down. It shows the phenomenal success of air pollution policies. Okay, this didn't take a UNFCCC, this didn't take a IPCC. It was done individually, each nation's. So I still think that may be the best way to go here. And while we are dusting off the mirrors, so from a climate guy, this is disaster. Okay? Because each ton of sulfur you remove, it's adding a warming comparable to 350 tons of CO2. You're removing the mirrors. So the masking. Okay, so the mask over US and Western Europe has been thinned down by 50%. I can almost look through and see who is doing this. Whereas China is rapidly putting more mirrors, masking its warming. Okay? And I know I see in the media, and when US have whole dialogue with China, we are beating up on the Chinese on the SO to use clean coal. I'm not saying we should ask China to use dirty coal, but when you want to remove the sulfur, make sure you bring down the smoke with it, the black carbon. Okay, so that's where the black carbon should be linked with other air pollutants. We have such a policy, but we talk about particulate emission. So it turns out from automobiles, diesel trucks, a lot of the particulates is black carbon. So inadvertently we have brought the black carbon down. I think we have to declare black carbon as a pollutant, just like we have declared SO2 as a pollutant. Okay? So I just want to conclude with the other major success story we have. I'm feeling that we are all down in the dumps focusing on the CO2. We have to cut CO2. Please don't get me wrong. But we don't have a policy. But we have a policy for them in terms of air pollution. Let's use that to bring black carbon. Another of the major success stories is CFCs. So this was the paper I published pointing out the greenhouse effect of CFCs nearly 35 years ago. That showed that one molecule of CFC has the same warming as 10,000 molecules of CO2. When that was published, no one believed it, including my own wife. So I said, this is crazy. It took about 10 years for the community to accept it. Now it turns out, because of the Montreal Protocol, the CFCs we have brought down is equivalent to removing 200 billion tons of CO2. So we have already had enormous success in thinning that blanket. So I don't know how we persuaded China and India to conform to the Montreal Protocol. Whatever we did, let's do the same thing in the case of climate change. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And we're going to shift on over to another scientist, bringing it more focused on what EPA is doing in China. And there's Pete. Thanks.
Good morning. I'm happy to be here to talk about EPA's cooperative efforts with China on air quality and sort of its spillover effects into climate. I really am a substitute for Dale Everett, who at the last minute got the flu and could not be here. So this may be a little rough, but we'll see what we can do. EPA has been working closely with our counterparts in China for about 10 years to address air quality issues. And in fact, in October, when we were there for some regional air quality management meetings, we actually had a little celebration and gift exchange with the Chinese to sort of commemorate this 10th anniversary of this work. More recently, we've looked for opportunities for continued improvement in air quality in ways that can also have climate benefits. And I'd like to give a brief overview of our cooperation with China and on air quality and clean energy, and then sort of illustrate some opportunities for simultaneously addressing climate. This slide really is just a list of factoids of how horrible air pollution is in China and why it's so bad. But I'm not going to read this slide, but home to 7 of the 10 worst cities. They have to double their electric generating capacity every decade, and of course they are heavily reliant on dirty coal. World Health Organization estimates 700,000 premature deaths per year. And then skipping down to the last one, which is near and dear to me as a mobile source person, is that the demand for private vehicles is rising exponentially in China, as it is in many other developing countries as they motorize and as their economies improve. This figure of Beijing adding 4,000 to 5,000 vehicles per month, I've seen figures that are higher than that. But and I don't know whether all of you have ever been to China, but if people who went 15 years ago to Beijing talk about all the bicycles they saw, and somebody who would have gone last week for the first time would talk about all the cars and motorcycles and ring roads and traffic and congestion and air pollution they saw. So it really has changed quite a bit. Early on, we recognized the need to be strategic with our Chinese partners for a couple of reasons. One, of course, is we recognize that China's importance as a developing country with a rapidly developing economy. They are the factory of the world, essentially, and their footprint is all over the global environment, especially on air quality and climate. But we also have to more effectively deploy what are really limited resources. We do not have large budgets at EPA for international work, and of course we wanted to have as broad an impact as possible. So our goals were to help improve China's air quality, reduce emissions, which, as we've seen from the previous presentation, certainly have the potential to affect the U.S. and get transported to the U.S. We wanted to assist them in developing a sustainable industry and support particularly better characterization and modeling and inventory. We focused on regional air quality management, on the power sector, and on transport sector, and we worked through things like the U.S.-China strategic and economic dialogue, as well as some of these global partnership programs like methane to markets and clean indoor air. Under the Clean Air and Energy Strategy and this S&ED, we worked closely with our Chinese friends on some major projects, and I won't read through this list, but regional air quality management is certainly one of them, SO2 trading, and clean fuels and vehicles, which is my area, mobile sources. And I'll have, in the remaining slides, we'll touch a little bit on some of these items, particularly with modeling and emissions assessment projects. We've focused on 3 main areas: Beijing and Shanghai, and then the Pearl River Delta. These areas are major industrial and population centers with heavy motorization, heavy fuel usage, etc. And we've worked with these areas to better characterize air quality by helping them improve emission inventories and monitoring, etc. Oh, okay. Just to give you an idea about some work that we were involved in with modeling, starting back in 2003, we worked with Beijing on their initial modeling, and what became clear to us was that we needed to look at not just at Beijing, but look at this as a regional issue. And the result of this work was to show that more than half of Beijing's air quality problem was really due to sources outside of its borders or outside of its control. And what this did was it led Beijing officials to, when they started to figure out ways to clean up Beijing for the Olympics, it led them to do a multi-province study to try to ascertain where did all this pollution come from, what were the fates and effects of the air pollution. And so ultimately what they did is they implemented a regional approach to control emissions for the Olympic period and the subsequent period as well. I mentioned, or one of the earlier slides showed this Air Now, and this is something we're involved in Shanghai and the Yangtze River Delta. Air Now is kind of an early warning system that's used in the U.S. to provide air quality information on traditional pollutants, particularly PM10, to policymakers and the citizenry. Air Now is how we alert people in the U.S. so that they can take action to reduce their exposure to air pollution. So basically, by implementing this in Shanghai, and the idea is to unveil it prior to the upcoming Shanghai World Expo, which takes place this May, we are exporting our approach and our tools to China. Okay, this is my area, clean fuels and vehicles. We have been involved in China with the federal government as well as with the Beijing government and with the Guangzhou provincial government as well on various mobile source activities. One of the things that we did, I think that's most significant, is we conducted a demo project on retrofitting buses in Beijing starting in about 2005. We started with 20 buses and funded partly by EPA. And before we were done with that 20 bus project, the Beijing EPB had launched off on a 100 bus retrofit demo program using a lot of the lessons learned from our project. And it was a very difficult project because of the condition of the buses, the quality of the maintenance, and the approach that the bus companies took toward the maintenance of the buses, which basically was, if the buses generate revenue, then they're in good shape. But we got through the project and learned a whole lot of lessons, and Beijing EPB began to apply those lessons, and were able to retrofit 6,000 buses and trucks with diesel particulate filters that Dr. Ramanathan talked about in his presentation. But these filters basically take out all of the particulates, including the black carbon. I was there in October, and they've now gotten that number up to somewhere around 8,500 to 9,000 trucks and buses that they've retrofitted with diesel particulate filters. So this is one big success story. While we were there, we trained the Beijing EPB in emission testing protocols and how to use portable emission monitoring systems. And it really has come out to be a success story for EPA. We've also done things like run workshops on clean fuels and compliance management. Compliance is a particular issue for China. You can have the tightest emission standards in the world, but if you don't have a good compliance monitoring and management system, the standards really aren't worth very much. We've continued to press on the systems approach to vehicles and fuels, and the systems approach is that you regulate fuels and vehicles at the same time to get the sulfur out, because you need to get the sulfur out for a variety of reasons, but one of those reasons is you need to get the sulfur out to enable the state-of-the-art emission control technologies for both gasoline and diesel-fueled vehicles. We've also provided a lot of technical assistance over the years on things like onboard diagnostics and durability testing, etc. We have brought engineers from the Ministry of Environmental Protection to EPA for months at a time and trained them at our lab in Ann Arbor and as well at our offices in D.C., and it's really gratifying to go back and see them working at fairly high levels in China in the Ministry of Environmental Protection. So we continue to in the future, we will continue to press the low sulfur fuel policy in the 12th five-year plan, and look for opportunities to work with China on compliance and retrofit programs in Beijing and other parts of China. This is a chart developed by the International Council for Clean Transportation. It's not an EPA chart, but it shows what would happen in the case where China adopted Euro 5 vehicle and fuel standards, what the impacts would be, and very significant reductions in mortality, 1.5 million deaths avoided, and very large benefits, economic benefits, benefit-to-cost ratio, as they calculated, of 20 to 1. And that kind of benefit-to-cost ratio is very similar to what we see in the United States with our clean diesel rules. We've seen in the range of things up to 40 to 1. Moving on to the issues where we have sources that produce both traditional pollutants and also produce climate agents. We think that shared solutions are more efficient to tackle those things. Setting clear goals for both air quality and climate helps us do better planning and more efficient implementation. We can use the public health co-benefits of these climate strategies to help offset the costs and justify the programs. In the past, our air quality strategies were perhaps designed without climate in mind, and perhaps were not always beneficial to climate. For example, end-of-pipe controls, such as scrubbers, can be very energy intensive, and we need to seek to avoid approaches that lead to these kind of disbenefits. Certainly reductions in some air pollutants, like you heard in their earlier presentations, such as sulfates, can unmask or can lead to warming, but reducing those compounds is essential for public health. So we have to understand those impacts, and we have to time, as Dr. Ramanathan said, we have to time the removal of the sulfur with the implementation of controls that get rid of the black carbon. And so, I mean, what we've tried to do in the United States is get sulfur out of the fuel just ahead of the requirement to install diesel particulate filters, and certainly that's what we would encourage in other countries as well. Integrating air quality efforts with efforts to address climate change seems to be both logical and practical. I think the previous speaker covered this pretty well. The changing climate is clearly going to affect air quality and vice versa. The source of air pollution and climate-forcing pollutants are often the same, like with diesel black carbon, for example, and diesel NOx. So having integrated programs to control these pollutants at the same time really makes sense. I think this one was pretty well covered, but in particular, black carbon emissions in Asia have the potential to impact the Himalayan region and the glaciers, and potentially accelerating the melting of those glaciers, which are important for drinking and irrigation to over a billion people. I think again, my predecessor here had a similar slide to this, and this data is a little bit old, but the red bar on the very left is basically China and their black carbon emissions. The U.S. is about 7 bars over, and I think if we had more recent data, we would see that bar on the left is much higher, and that perhaps the U.S. bar and if there's a bar on there for Europe and Canada, they might be a little lower now to the greater use of diesel particulate filters. And then just looking at black carbon emissions by sector in China, again, this one is about the same age as the previous data, so it's a little dated, but I think residential predominates to this day, but certainly I would expect that yellow slice of the pie from transport in China is probably a lot bigger than it was in 1996. Let's see, challenges for black carbon. The location of the reductions, and again, my predecessor talked about this, but the location of the reductions really matters because these pollutants are more local and regional in nature, which I think helps to understand why we're starting to look at the Arctic nations and how much black carbon is produced in the Arctic nations that gets carried into the Arctic region. And then sort of as we get toward the end here, talk about some upcoming opportunities. China is completing the process of revising its air pollution control law. It's basically its Clean Air Act, and hopes to do that this spring. That will enable some new standards for fine particles and ozone. I still don't think they'll be able to regulate fuels under their Clean Air Act as we are, which is one of the problems they have in China. They're unable to sync up the regulations of fuels with the implementation of mobile source standards, for example, and that's been a particular difficulty for them. The 12th five-year plan will build on goals and targets that were established in the previous five-year plan, including additional reductions in sulfate and new targets for NOx. And of course, as the previous speaker said, then there are issues there because you're reducing the cooling particles. We expect that they'll have further reductions in pollution and black carbon as they implement stricter car and truck and maybe even non-road standards. And certainly there are opportunities then for targeting black carbon reductions as part of any development of new standards for PM 2.5. And we're certainly encouraged. The last bullet on this slide talks about 50 part per million fuel. This is basically the maximum sulfur content you can have in diesel fuel and still use a passive diesel particulate filter. We have 15 part per million diesel fuel now in the United States, where we've had DPFs or diesel particulate filters on every new truck since 2007. But we're encouraged that China is starting to see some low sulfur diesel in the 50 part per million range in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou, and this will ultimately facilitate the use of filters in these areas, and it has already helped with the 8,000 or 9,000 filters that are on trucks and buses in the Beijing area. And last slide, I think, in the future, integrating clean air and climate, public health impacts will continue to be significant and to drive the control programs, but we're certainly starting to recognize and pay more attention to co-benefits and recognizing that we can tailor our programs to get climate co-benefits if we try. Certainly there's an optimal investment path unique for China, and more of our modeling and integrated modeling can help to reveal what this optimal path is to deal with both the traditional pollutants and the climate programs, and we need to develop better analytical tools to highlight these choices. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yay. Yeah, we will sometime soon hopefully get one of John's colleagues, hopefully Jeremy Schweifels, to come here and talk at some point after the 12th five-year plan is passed about the work that EPA has been doing on that. So. I'm so glad, Pete, you get to do this. I never liked. That's Pete Marsters, my assistant. Yay, Pete. Who makes things happen, not just PowerPoints. Even though he didn't get us green scones this morning. There you go. And that would be you. Dennis, take it over.
Thanks. My name's Dennis Clare, and I thought since you know what scientists do and you know who at EPA is, that I'd just mention what we are at IGSD. We're a group of lawyers who work on international climate policy, largely on the treaties for ozone. I've recently served as one of the delegates for the country of Micronesia to the UNFCCC process. So we try to figure out what are the best forms of governance to coordinate and facilitate the things that the scientists and the regulators tell us we probably need to do. I want to start with a caveat. Ram's told us about the dangers of charring or burning biomass, but there's one exception that I thought I would bring up this day. If you roast biomass and put it into liquids, it turns out that it's healthy. People have known this since about 1759, and since we're on the subject of co-benefits, it also involves a little carbon dioxide sequestration. So,
Pete, this is what we could have had at our breakfast.
anyway, happy St. Patrick's Day.
Goodness.
Moving on. So, how is black carbon being regulated? Which is what I should talk about, except for it's not really as itself. It's regulated where it is regulated as a part of particulate matter, which is regulated in many places, but there are many species and there are many sizes. And even though the regulations have led to significant reductions in some places, they haven't always been key reductions of black carbon. Black carbon is pretty small, so if you reduce the number of particles or the mass of particles, you might not necessarily be getting at black carbon. So thinking about the types of PM regulations that there are, PM10 is for 10 micrometers size particles. PM 2.5 is 2.5 micrometers. But BC is typically much smaller than either of these. So where you have PM 2.5, you tend to get a little more of the BC, but BC is even smaller than that. So it might be worth thinking about how to target BC itself as a species rather than just a part of particulate matter, or at least go after the sources that are the most harmful sources of BC. So what do I mean by which are the most harmful? Well, in terms of the climate, as Ram pointed out, most aerosols are light in color and so have a cooling effect. Black carbon is dark, has a warming effect. The problem is, of course, these particles are often co-emitted with each other. So when you think about warming, which sources are most harmful, it tends to be the sources with the higher percentage or ratio of the dark particles to the light particles. If you get more of the dark ones out, your net climate impact is a benefit. So, for example, same picture as in the last presentation. I've seen this picture in a lot of presentations, and I realized last night when I was putting this together that it's the first one you get if you use a Google search for diesel. But this is obviously not very healthy, and I put the not like Guinness thing for two reasons. One, because it's not healthy, and we've learned that Guinness is. And two, because although you roast 10% of your barley, you still get a fully black beer. With smoke, if you only had 10% black carbon, you probably wouldn't see smoke that's quite that black. So I know the scientists might jump on me for this, but as a very bad general rule, the darker the smoke, the more likely you are to have that higher ratio of black carbon, and therefore the more likely you'll have a climate benefit as well as a health benefit if you reduce it. Okay, so what are other sources that you might want to go after? Sources whose emissions are killing people. This, again, is a picture from the last presentation as well. But it kind of gets to the point because the people who are most affected are women and children cooking on traditional stoves or wood-burning fires. These aren't necessarily, these don't necessarily have the high ratios of black carbon to organic carbon, dark particles to light particles that diesel has, but when it's killing people directly, we have no reason not to do it. A recent paper, it came out by Natalia Unger and Tammy Bond, says that despite the lower ratio, there's still a predominance of the darker absorbing particles, which include black carbon and some less dark but also absorbing particles called brown carbon. So it looks like here you're definitely saving some lives. You're probably getting a pretty solid climate benefit. And of course, if you are anywhere near ice and snow, even emissions with a more balanced ratio are pretty harmful for the climate because over the snow, the light particles don't really reflect more than the snow would have. So they don't have as much of a cooling effect, but the dark particles still have their warming effect. So this is tried to exemplify this here, or illustrate this. So if you have a light particle over a dark surface, it's going to have more of a cooling effect because it's going to reflect what the dark surface might have absorbed. Vice versa, if you have a dark particle over a light surface, it's going to have enhanced effect because it's going to absorb what might have been reflected. So again, even when you have a more balanced collection of particles coming out, if you're anywhere near ice and snow, or if those particles are going directly into people's lungs, then you want to go after them. Okay, so that leads us back to the U.S. and China. In the U.S., diesel vehicles emit the majority of the really nasty black carbon. Maybe not the majority of the plurality. I think they're about 48, 49% of U.S. BC emissions. In China, you have a little more balanced medley of sources, but still the biomass burning and the biomass traditional cooking is the majority of the emissions. Part of the value of thinking about this, though, is that China's vehicle fleet is just now growing, or it's underway, but there's a lot to come. So if we can put the proper filters on before that vehicle fleet gets ramped up, we can head off a lot of emissions that we might have otherwise seen. Okay, so obviously we're talking about China-U.S. cooperation, but it turns out that these four groups, I won't say countries because the EU is not a country, but they constitute a majority of the BC from contained combustion. That's basically BC that's not including the open biomass burning and deforestation. So if we could get these parties to cooperate and get a good jump on the BC that's coming from them, we would have a very good jump on BC in the world as a whole, and we would certainly have a good jump on BC that gets to the ice and snow regions, both Arctic and the Himalayas. However, I wanted to point out this is from a U.S. climate change science program, which is now called Global Change, I believe, report on short-lived climate forces by Drew Shindell, who testified with Ram yesterday and who was the author of, sorry, he's the lead author of this. There were many authors. But he's the lead author of this, and he was also the author of the paper that discovered that half of the warming in the Arctic may be attributable to BC. That is half the warming in the last 100 years or so. So this is where you're seeing a lot of the emissions of the short-lived forcers. And then this is a map of summer 2100 surface temperature change based upon those emissions. So to go back again, emissions are coming out largely where it's darker red, and then in summer 2100 projection, the impacts are where it's darker red here. So you'll see the emissions again, lots of emissions in East Asia, significant amount in the U.S. and Europe, but then the U.S. really gets hit right in the summer, right in the heartland. So we should really care what other countries are doing, especially if we want to continue to grow food. This is just a larger example of the larger phenomenon of how we have to cooperate. What Ram was saying, we're not pointing fingers here, but there are certain areas that are just going to be geographically disadvantaged because of these emissions. But there are some good things that are being done. We'll start, although it's not chronological order, with some studies. So this will show you how black carbon is kind of gaining steam in the policy world. U.S. Congress has called upon EPA to draft a report on BC. What are the sources, its warming effects, metrics for measuring them, potential mitigation options here and abroad. UNEP is undertaking assessment of non-CO2 climate forcers, largely based upon what it's learned from Ram's work, and he will be a large part of that, of course. I think he's a co-chair of that. The Arctic Council also is promising that it's conducting assessment of black carbon impacts and some other short-lived forcers like methane and tropospheric ozone, because, of course, the Arctic is warming at about people were saying 2 times the global average about a year and a half ago, and now they're thinking it's already up to 2.5 to 3 times the global average. And if Drew Schindel's paper is right that half of that may be from black carbon, then certainly the countries that are near the Arctic would want to address that. LRTAP, the Convention for Long Range, Convention, wait, what did I think? It's Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution. I didn't put that right on there. But it's a group of countries, Convention on Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution. The letters are wrong. Is also investigating what it can do to address short-lived forcers, including BC. USAID is finalizing a report, and the Indian government is now undertaking a study as well. I'll get back to the advantages and disadvantages of sort of thinking about regional arrangements or smaller arrangements like LRTAP in a few minutes. In addition to the studies and reports, there have been some higher level acknowledgments and commitments. It's unclear whether they're true commitments or somewhat lip service, but last year at the G8 leaders committed to addressing black carbon. So we'll have to see if there's any follow-up on that and what type of follow-up will come. But it's certainly, again, gaining attention in the policy community. As 2 examples, you might have already heard about the U.S., but the U.S. and EU have strong emissions requirements for vehicles. These usually apply to new vehicles, and they reduce more than 90%. The manufacturers of these filters will say probably 99%, but I'm just being conservative here. And India has recently launched a national biomass cook stoves initiative. So they're at least thinking about the particle pollution that comes from the biomass cooking that kills, according to WHO, about 1.5 million people a year, and about 400,000 of those are in India. So they have good reason to think about swapping out their stoves. However, the U.S. and the EU should also require their in-use vehicles to be retrofitted so that they can get the BC coming out of those. In-use diesel vehicles, or diesel vehicles in general, can last decades. So the ones that are already on the road or were already on the road when the regulations came out might still be on the road for several decades. If we can get to them, then we can get the advantages and the benefits that we're after even sooner, save more lives. And of course, if climate change is potentially nonlinear, then the earlier you get to the mitigation, the less long-term problems you have. And then finally, specifically with regard to snow and ice, you obviously have to protect those before they melt. So that's a good reason to do that now rather than wait for the fleet to turn over. India is underway with the biomass cooking stoves initiative, but as people who study cook stoves will point out, although there have been lots of improvements, it's not always clear what the improvements are across the different categories. I mean, you could have improvements that are using less fuel. You could have improvements that are emitting fewer particles. But what we need to figure out is how do we reduce total particles, reduce fuel use, and make sure especially that we're getting the BC, for example, not just the other particles when we're near snow and ice. So when they continue to develop this biomass program, they should think about these various rubrics, because it's not just health and it's not just reducing mass or number of particles. Okay, so 4 things to consider in general, and then perhaps we can discuss basically the key actions that you need to take to reduce black carbon. These are examples. There are others, but as examples, we talked about cook stoves, talked about diesels, whether you retrofit or retire vehicles that are just too dirty to retrofit but might still stay on the road if you don't retire them. There's also boilers, kilns, coke ovens. We haven't talked so much about that today, but those are other sources of particulates, black carbon especially. They're being improved, of course, because lots of countries, including China, are working on energy efficiency, and energy efficiency is a great way to get at black carbon because black carbon is a product of inefficient combustion. But those are obviously a another sector that we could look at. Springtime agricultural burning is problematic because the particles can help accelerate the melting. They can lead the melt season to start earlier and to last longer. So burning in the spring is particularly bad because it's the beginning of the melt season, and the particles will not only help melt the snow and ice, but there's evidence that as the snow and ice melts, the particles kind of stay on top. So as the season goes along, the snow and ice diminishes, but the particles are kind of staying on top, so they're on top of the next level of snow and ice. So then there's the policies that would catalyze these actions, whether you give a mandate or a tax incentive or whatever policy options you can think of. Seems to be a word missing. So regulate springtime burning and enforce. There's a lot of places that have springtime burning rules, but they're not necessarily always well enforced. So in addition to thinking about what are the actions that need to be taken, you need to think about what are the policies that will catalyze those actions. We talked about integrating air pollution, but you can also think about development, health, and the more of the co-benefits you can bring on board, obviously the more cost-effective these types of measures become, especially with cook stoves, because we have a lot of people worrying about poverty reduction, access to energy, development, climate. These issues overlap, and people will understand the need to address things like cook stoves when they see the co-benefits across those criteria. And then finally, it's supposed to say governance regimes to coordinate and facilitate those policies. So basically we know that actions are going to be taken in a very concrete local spot, probably as a result of a national program, and then we can think about what type of governance might facilitate the coordination of those national programs. Some countries might have the resources and be isolated enough that their pollution doesn't have too much effects on other people and they can just take care of it, their pollution that is. Other countries might want to cooperate on a regional basis because obviously in close quarters the pollution can affect neighbors. Other countries might be in a region where all their neighbors want to address black carbon, but that region may just not have the resources to do so. So thinking about facilitating the policies is thinking about perhaps what regional mechanisms like LURTAP that could be used, perhaps a larger international mechanism like the UNFCCC, smaller pollution treaties. The IMO, the International Maritime Organization, is presently working on sulfur reductions, which is obviously good for health. But you heard in the presentation, the last presentation, that you can't really get the filters going until you get down to at least about 50 parts per million sulfur. And the IMO is trying to get regulations in place where they can bring it down to about 500 parts per million sulfur. So we're still not at the point where the sulfur rules will allow the filters. So we have to think about how to be careful on not unmasking there. The World Bank, GEF, UNDP point there is very similar to the point I made about the co-benefits when you're thinking about whether it's not just climate but development, health, access to energy, etc. I will note that I'm actually a negotiator for Micronesia, so I've been involved in the proposal that they have for addressing black carbon and short-lived forces under the UNFCCC. And the idea here is not to have a sort of top-down mandate that the world needs to go around reducing black carbon in accordance with the treaty. The idea here is, as it says, to facilitate opportunities to reduce black carbon where you might be able to. So a country like China or India might prefer a bilateral arrangement with each other or with the U.S. in addressing black carbon, but a country like Micronesia with limited resources and not part of a region that's going to put a priority on this might want to participate in a UNFCCC program or a UNEP program. So we're really just trying to facilitate measures to encourage these reductions that are most suitable to wherever the countries that are interested in making them are. And I just made the point that is articulated on this slide. But it's not just a matter of the governance here. It's actually a matter of the geophysical and the geographical differences too. Because, for example, we've heard about China's interest in protecting their water, interest in not changing up the rainfall patterns. For a place like Micronesia, it's more about sea level rise. Micronesia does happen to generate most of its electricity from diesel generators. So if you're involved in bilateral relations with smaller countries, maybe help them shift to renewable. So it's not just, again, the governance mechanism, but it's the actual different geographical, geophysical impacts that different countries are concerned about. We need governance that facilitates the work to be done and helps it get done wherever parties are interested in doing it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, wonderful. Now I've got my wonderful research interns, Nick and Ada, who will have microphones. So when you ask questions, I would beg you, well, no, I order you, I like that, to speak into the mic, say your name and affiliation. And Ada, why don't we start there at the back, and then Nick, pass the mic to this gentleman here. So we've got about 40 minutes for succinct, quick questionings. Go for it.
Okay, two quick questions for
name and affiliation.
Jacob Moss with US EPA. For Dr. Ramanathan. One is there anything you can say in a sort of summary kind of way about where the things stand on the glacial melt in the Himalayas in terms of some of the recent controversies and what we know and what we don't know there? And then secondly, on your paper with Greg Carmichael from 2008, you sort of indicated a much stronger forcing from BC than the IPCC had. There's sort of always a tension between following new science and wanting to take advantage of that, but also looking at the sort of scientific review process before making policies based on that. Do you have any sort of sense of where that stands and how you think that will evolve over time?
Right. So do we take all the questions?
Yeah, no, we'll just
respond?
answer this. We'll
Okay.
answer.
So I think on the Himalayan glaciers, there's probably no one here who doesn't know about this. I think the basic question was not really whether the glaciers are retreating. The question was about the prediction about a future, that it's going to disappear on such and such a date. So as best as I understand, those predicted dates were wrong. And I think IPCC put a retraction on it. I don't know if they use as strong a words I'm saying, but they're clearly wrong to say it's going to disappear on such a date. We can't say that for anything. Mm-hmm. And but so leaving that aside, there's been papers published by scientists in India, and then Lonnie Thompson's group here using ice cores, and then the national assessment of China. They all clearly show the glaciers are retreating. The numbers used are 2/3 of the glaciers are retreating, but some are advancing from the western side, the western Himalayas region. But overall, I think the controversy started because there was an Indian government-sponsored study by a geologist who says, on average, he concludes there's not much of a retreat as far as the Indian glaciers are concerned. So that's where matters stand. And I think clearly the issue is, I'm not surprised at all this, confusing and conflicting reports, simply because they're not monitored. There are very few so-called baseline stations. The way you measure glacial retreat, you put stakes in them, and then every year see how the stakes go up and down. And also you need to measure energy budget. So they're not available, but on the Chinese side, there are some good baseline stations, and the China's national government report does talk about glacial retreat. So I think that's where it stands. It's still a science in the making, and so that's the first thing I want to mention. So going to the second question of, I showed the IPCC's estimates is close to 25% of the CO2 forcing, and my own estimate is 55%. The only difference is that the IPCC studies are at least 5 years old. Remember, by definition, they can only report on studies which were published by 2005. Okay? And the second thing is, there were, whereas my study was not model-based, it's constrained by observations. And like I say in my talks, I don't trust anything unless I can touch it, feel it, smell it, and sense it. In the case of black carbon, I can do all of the above. But that doesn't make my estimates any more, closer to reality than those. In the case of black carbon, the uncertainties are large. But there was a study published last year by the same group which was reported in the IPCC, and it was alarming. They compared their predicted simulated observations of black carbon. Over all of Asia, they were off by a factor of 2 to 3, under-predicting. Okay? On the other hand, their simulated black carbon concentration over North America were off by a factor of 3. They were over-predicting. So the models have a long way to go. And as from EPA, the emission inventories are the hardest thing to get at. And the model's starting point, I feel, is wrong. I don't know if they would take the strong position, but they know their emission inventories have a problem. It has to be relooked at. And we can't blame them. There were few groups like Tammy Barnes who have done fantastic efforts. But this is a multi-million-dollar problem getting at the emission sources. And there's not much resource in that field. So that's what I would say. And I showed in the EPA meeting, I have been maintaining 4-5-year observatory looking at the Indian black carbon emission from the Indian Ocean. And we have started a comparison with models, and they are off by a factor of 2 to 2.5, systematically under-predicting.
Okay. Wow, there's somebody making it. This gentleman here, and then here.
My name is John Topping with the Climate Institute. First, I wanted to commend you. Those are 3 remarkable presentations, and I hope it might be possible to place these, or a sanitized version if there's something proprietary.
It reveals all. We have these. This will be put on archived on our website with a summary. So
wonderful,
we don't hide anything.
Wonderful, great. And the actual question right here, as the presentations indicated, aside from the air pollution requirements, essentially there is, at least officially, not a value for black carbon, even though it's what can make far and away the biggest difference. Now, there are two slightly encouraging things underway in that direction, and then I was hoping we could also talk about the prospects of moving officially. I mean, there was a project we became aware of a few days ago, an Australian group, Rotec, that's making a device that essentially greatly increases the efficiency of diesel, has worked out an arrangement with the Jeepney Owners Association in Greater Manila, where in the next few years in the Philippines, it may be possible to essentially retrofit the Jeepneys at no cost other than maybe a nominal peso a year or so, which is just to establish the ownership rights exist otherwise, and produce a 75% reduction using voluntary emission reduction credits, where they have a little more latitude. And there's an effort underway to create a life cycle greenhouse analysis that for an ANSI standard in the U.S. that might eventually lead to an ISO that would govern major projects that would actually establish real values for black carbon, and eventually could have a real impact there. But I also wanted to sort of throw out, how long is it before the official system will catch up with it? Because it looks right now like we're going to have to finance an awful lot of this either by bilateral arrangements or by these voluntary emission reduction credits and so forth, and the whole international system set up officially, the European trading system, et cetera, will be far, far less efficient than these informal arrangements are rising. But when can we eventually get the the UNFCCC system in line?
Okay. They're all rushing to answer this.
I'm all for it. That's why we've proposed that be done. There are some political issues. There's a whole controversy over who's responsible for global warming in general, not just black carbon. And as someone who's representing a developing country, the position of developing countries, G77 in general, is that the Kyoto principles of the largest historical emitters basically going first should stay in play. When you start thinking about black carbon, because of the emissions that come from China and India, if you're not careful, it could look like you're trying to say, or trying to get around that and say, oh, the big new issue is actually the emissions from the historical people who are not, the parties that were not historically the largest emitters. So the reason we presented the proposal in the way we did was not to make it a mandate for parties to have to reduce a certain amount like the Kyoto targets, but for parties who were interested in participating in such a program or who needed some funding, that they could do so. Because the stoves and the diesel are fundamentally development issues, some countries prefer to address black carbon as a development issue, which is fair enough. We're not so worried about the motive as just getting the work done. I think that's what's important here. So if one system, a UNEP program, is good for one country and a regional arrangement is good for another country, that may be okay. Although, as the second or third strongest climate forcing agent, I think personally that the UNFCCC should either officially take this up and say, let's think about how to address this, or punt officially and say, let's coordinate with UNEP or someone else to address this. But all the articles coming out are saying climate effects of black carbon, and as long as that momentum's there, then the big climate body has to say something. One small other technicality is that the climate convention, the objective is to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, and of course these are particles, not greenhouse gases, so there's all kinds of legalistic excuses, but certainly I think that if it's the second or third strongest climate forcing agent, then the climate framework body should at least say something, address it, begin a study, but we can't just wait for the climate body can't wait for the WHO can't wait for UNEP. Somebody's got to pull these people into a room and figure out what we're going to do about it.
Ram, do you have anything to add to this? No? Well, I had a question for Dennis that you had in your slides. You had that nice picture of the 4 flags of U.S., China, Europe, and India. And I'm wondering, is there any, that these 4 countries as the leading emitters of BC should kind of get together, is there any kind of mechanism, or, I mean, already we do have, as John talked about, the U.S. and China have this long-standing cooperation, and right. I'm not quite sure, maybe also, John, does the EPA work with India on similar issues?
Yeah, we actually have a similar demonstration project underway in Pune to demonstrate diesel particulate filters, and in 11 major cities in India, presumably next month they are due to get 50 ppm diesel fuel. So there's hope for the capability to use filters in India.
And I think that I think Jacob, there's the EPA. There's the clean cook stove stuff. That's EPA is it you that, or the EPA is working?
We certainly have partners there, and the Indian government, as I think Dennis, someone mentioned, is just announced that they're going to start a major national cook stove initiative. So that we'll be working with them obviously.
Yeah. So basically, it's kind of like there is these kind of bilateral things
getting
going
there.
on.
The U.S. ambassador to India was at the launch of the Indian cook stove initiative, and Ram and I have both participated in what's been called the EU-India high-level dialogue, me through our European office. So Europe and India are thinking of coordinating on this issue. It's just a matter of keeping the pedal to the metal here, so that we move forward without necessarily blaming each other. I think the point that Ram made about how the pollution keeps moving around is a point that we should not take lightly, because we need to take action and not blame each other.
Okay, we got Nick right here. Keep it moving. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Métis from the Clean Air Task Force, and I have 2 questions to Dr. Ramanathan, 2 related questions about BC emissions, particularly. We can see in that graph that emissions have gone up in both India and China, and my first part of my question is really about India. It seems like cook stoves are responsible for a large portion of BC emissions, and yet it doesn't seem like cook stove usage has gone up as much, say, since the 80s as emissions have gone up. So while they may be responsible for a large part of those emissions, I'm wondering what you think, which sources are responsible for the increase we've seen in, say, the last 30 years. And then in both India and China, again about emissions, a lot of people say that power plants aren't that significant in terms of BC because of the high temperatures that they burn fuels at, but there have been few measurements. So I'm wondering how significant you think power plants are in terms of BC emissions in both India and China.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think both your questions related with emissions. So let me preface it by a comment I wanted to make with what Jennifer said, that EU, India, China, and the US are the major source of black carbon. That is, if you consider black carbon emissions from contained combustion, or like indoor cooking and fossil combustion. But if you look at the total black carbon emission, the open vegetation burning is 40%. Okay, and so in that, the savanna burning in Africa and the Brazil are biggies. So just to say that. Second thing is, all our emission inventories are uncertain by at least by a factor of 2, and the ones we frequently use is 1996. Mm-hmm. Who knows what has happened in the last 10 years? That's probably why the models disagree with our observations. All of my observations are on the ground side from 2006 to 2010. So as far as the cook stoves, you're saying that although the cook stove emission comes down, it's not clear to me because the population has increased. So the number of cook stoves has increased. My own estimate is right now it's about 150 million homes using cook stoves. So I honestly don't believe any of these inventories about time trends, because when we make ground in situ measurements, they completely disagree with what you simulate with emissions. And so the safest answer I can give you is I don't know. And I think this is where hopefully the EPA, this is probably where I see tremendous collaboration between the EPA here and India and China, because I think US has put tremendous amount of funds, they are not large compared to US standards, into these issues. So that could be used to improve the emission inventories, share the instruments, share technology, and so I see some huge benefits in joint India, US, China. They would welcome it. Also the models for dispersion of pollutants, their models I've seen are not really up to par. So this is where I think I can tell you that in the project Atmospheric Brown Clouds project, which is a project I chair, the UNEP, it involves all of the most of the Asian regions. There was a study which was published using the filter data with using isotopes. And they show at least 2/3 of the black carbon in the atmosphere, I can't say what's emitted, in the air is coming from biofuel burning, cooking, etc. So I think it's a major source. Beyond that, it's difficult to say how large.
And then, so the same kind of answer about the issue of the power plants.
Power plant issue, I really don't know in terms of coal. I think, if you use pulverized coal, it takes care of the black carbon emission. U.S. black carbon emission from coal-fired power plants is very low. It used to be large. I think somebody showed China's emission is 1.5 million tons a year. The U.S. emissions, if you go to 1950s, are larger. Yeah. So we know how we have controlled it. We have cut it down by a factor of 3. I think it's...
And in India, do you think, is that for those power plants using that kind of fuel? So are you also seeing low emissions from those, or could that be part of the rise as well?
It could be. I really don't know in terms of, like I said, all of these emission inventories. We don't know what is the factors they're using, emission factors.
I think it may be a little bit. Pulverized coal was the first step, and then we have supercritical and ultra supercritical, and then within those you have the grades of coal: anthracite, lignite, bituminous, subbituminous. And so we have a lot of lignite, anthracite in the U.S., which is sort of the cleaner, if you can call it that. In India, they do have bituminous, subbituminous coal, so there's a chance that it's going to be dirtier, and there might be some black carbon coming from that, but I don't think it's been tested. So that would definitely be something that we should probably look into.
Okay, we've got Lee here and then Suzanne. We'll ping pong back and forth, and we'll make our way around the table. Ada, can you give it to Lee right there?
Frances Lee, until recently from the National Science Foundation, and Dr. Ramanathan. I'm pleased that we were able to facilitate the flights that your team made to measure the black carbon. My question has to do with how you will be monitoring progress in reducing black carbon. Do you envision another set of flights in the future? And in China, we have heard that, at least before the Olympics, they moved the sites where they were monitoring the emissions so that progress would look good. And my question is, do you think that that's likely to happen again with regard to black carbon, or are the Chinese being more trustworthy in monitoring their own achievements?
Thank you. I think you're in the NSF International Program Office, I think. Yeah. Thanks for supporting us. Interestingly enough, the black carbon measurements are not that super hard. For example, just sitting in the Maldives, I'm downwind of India, so we have been able to monitor just with one station how it's been changing. And the Indians also have now a lot of black monitoring sites. And I think China has a number of sites. I'm sitting in Jeju Island in Korea with my Korean scientists looking at Chinese pollution. But it's not, we can't see throughout this. China is so large. So they have black carbon sites, and there are some good measurements. I don't know if they're being shared. That I don't know. As far as the Beijing Olympics, we have a paper just being reviewed in Nature. There's a big surprise there. But I think all I would say is that whatever they did helped in cutting down the pollution. And I don't know, but they're changing the station. This is the first time I'm hearing. But fortunately, we can see from space the pollution did come down tremendously. But the issue is Mother Nature is always cruel. It turns out part of the precipitation was larger than usual, not only in Beijing's surrounding regions. So the question is, the fact that the Olympics was not as polluted as we thought, was it because there is an increase in precipitation unrelated to this, or is it due to decrease in the actual reductions? Both probably helped.
Okay, be working our way around the table. Nate, why don't you start down at the end, and we'll work our way around. So that woman right there.
Hi, my name is Alexandra Giese from the Earth Policy Institute, and I have two questions for Dr. Ramanathan. The first one is whether you could...
Can you hold it closer and just... Sorry.
There we go. The first one is whether you could clarify the physical mechanisms linking black carbon to glacier melt. I know you alluded to albedo, but you were also talking about a decrease in precipitation in the context of the Indian monsoon. So I was just wondering if you could clarify the mechanisms linking those two things. And also, I know you talked about the shortcomings of models for black carbon, but I was wondering if there's been any quantification of black carbon contribution to glacial melt in regions other than the Arctic.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I think the first question was about the mechanisms, and I'm impressed you picked up on a subtle issue, which is, I'm just relying on my own work here. Some of it is observations and some are deductions using models, which are subject to verification. So there are three things happening, as far as I'm concerned, in the glaciers trying to deplete the snowpack. Okay? The first is black carbon. I showed how the brown cloud is surrounding the Himalayas, both from the China and the South Asian side, so that heats the air by direct sunlight absorption. And the warm air goes up and sort of causes anomalously large warming. And the Chinese have shown that the warming over the elevated regions of the plateau is about 2 to 3 times larger than surface warming. Okay, I mean, the Chinese are alarmed by it. It was warming about 0.2 degrees per decade. Okay, that's number one. And greenhouse warming by itself can't explain such a large warming. So the first step is heating the air. And the second is, at least my studies show, and the observations show, the monsoon has been decreasing. So the supply of moisture to the glaciers are decreasing, but mainly in the eastern Himalayas. That's why I think I'm not surprised the Indians are claiming, oh, the western Himalaya, where they're close to, is expanding, whereas the Chinese are saying it's melting away. Okay? So there's a second insult on the glaciers. And the third is that the black carbon is settling on the snow and darkening the snow. So there are 3 things happening to decrease. And the fourth is the greenhouse warming. So there are 4 things happening at the same time to decrease the glaciers. But then other things I'm not adding is natural variability, which is huge. We know rainfall here. I don't have to tell the Washingtonians what happened to you this winter. So there is a huge natural variability, which is, I don't know how nature is pulling this.
In fact, you were supposed to come. We got that snow.
Right.
He wisely stayed in San Diego.
Right.
Well, actually, I don't think you can't get there. Can't get here from there during that week. So we'll go to Suzanne, but I want to interject a quick question. Maybe to I don't know which of you can answer. A lot of times when we're talking about particularly like U.S.-China energy-type cooperation or issues that lower greenhouse gases, that the topic of business opportunities arises, right? That the idea of not just these global fora that make decisions, but also that whether or not, my question is, in terms, maybe it's for cars, are there areas where, U.S. or European businesses can make some money in that they're BC lowering, or is, I don't know.
Yeah, I think
car man here.
There are opportunities certainly as they clean up their fuels and impose tighter standards. There's opportunities for advanced technologies to flow from other countries to China's to help them produce those products. I think what we're seeing though is the Chinese are producing an awful lot of that stuff themselves. The retrofit project that I talked about, where we installed about 20 retrofit devices that came from U.S. manufacturers. We're pretty sure that the 8,000 or 9,000 retrofit devices that they installed on their own were homegrown devices. So I think that is one of the realities of dealing with China, that they're very good at producing stuff on their own. But there certainly are some opportunities for advanced technologies.
But I also wanted to you answer that, and then I'll ask him another question. Go ahead.
I was going to say something similar on the side of stoves, maybe not quite as much pure profitability, but businesses can certainly help. Just as they discovered in Africa, the best way to distribute condoms is to put a box on a Coca-Cola truck, because Coca-Cola's got one of the better fleets moving around. Some companies have pretty good penetration in India and China that could help distribute these kinds of stoves. And people have discovered, I can maybe let Jacob follow up on this, that sometimes sociological issues on changing stoves are as important as the technological. So does your stove cook the food you want? If you give someone a stove, are they as likely to use it as if they have to pay something for it? Companies are good at figuring these things out. I know BP and Philips and other companies are starting to work on this, and I think Jacob could probably elaborate more intelligently than I have, but basically there's a role for companies to play to be helpful. Whether they can end up being profitable, I think, is not quite clear yet.
Sounds like I should do a meeting on this topic.
You certainly have interests.
Yes. Okay. Suzanne? It's like that. Part of the EPA tribe down there.
Yes. Hi. Suzanne Giannini-Spahn. I'm with EPA's Office of International Affairs. I'd like to thank all 3 panelists for some exceptionally clear presentations for someone who is really a novice in this field. Thank you very much. I feel a lot smarter. Whether or not I am, we'll see. But I do have a question that's almost, I guess I would say, the flip side of Jennifer's question, the flip side of profitability for the technology manufacturers. And that is that for us to address this problem, even though we may have great policies, it's going to require the companies and the individual consumers to either purchase new or retrofit existing technologies. And even without being in the middle of a global recession, there just isn't enough money in the public sector to finance all the needed changes. So a lot of the technologies, especially the end-of-pipe technologies like scrubbers and filters, actually yield negative economic benefits to the purchasers. That is to say, they are costly and they can't recover the costs. And if we're going to get people to buy them, it would be helpful if they actually saved money. Very similar to the improvements in cement kiln combustion efficiency, which reduces dioxins and furans, but also reduces fuel use. So my question is to the panel is there any special attention being given to the development of new technologies that actually save money instead of costing them to install? Thank you.
I would start by saying that it's similar to what I was trying to point out about the various rubrics or criteria for analyzing why these things are worth doing. For example, with stoves, you get the black carbon. You also, of course, if you improve efficiency, reduce CO2. So if you start adding up the potential cost analyzed benefits, you might end up with something that's that could be profitable. Ram can elaborate a little bit more on the idea of people getting CO2 credits under something like the CDM for stoves. And if it ends up being, if you end up reducing enough CO2 and potentially eventually black carbon could be included, then maybe it could be profitable for a user to improve their stove. But you again have to count, or likely it'd be in your best interest to count the various co-benefits from access to energy, development. You might not find a huge profitability if you're only looking under one lens.
No, yeah, I agree with you.
Okay, he covered what you meant. Yeah. All right. We're moving down here. Suzanne, you're going to say something else. She can grab the mic.
Being from the Environmental Protection Agency, I certainly understand the social benefits and the environmental benefits, but what my concern is to the person who has to buy them or the company that has to buy them. Currently, they're doing quite well without generating any of those, and so they will follow the economic benefits. That's all I'm saying. And there just isn't enough money in the public sector to pay for the costs. Thank you.
But I do know that in China, when we had Jonathan Sinton here a few years back, that did a review of China's Clean Cook Stove program, that they actually, they did do a massive number of replacement of cook stoves in 7 provinces. It was mind-boggling, and they had local companies, and that somehow there were incentives that were put in there that really did help. And I should dig up that summary, but I think that this is making me think more and more. I got to dig into cook stoves. Okay, come moving up down the table here. Can we do? I just want to get Anna Bertel, and then we're just going to come this. Just keep moving up. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Anna Bertel from the Congressional Executive Commission on China, and my question is for John. I know you're a mobile source person, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the U.S. EPA's work on the greenhouse gas emissions inventory program. If it's a little, I don't know, can you do that? So maybe some of the challenges, some of the successes.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It would have been. I think Dale, if he were here, could have done that one, but I can't do that one.
We're going to bring Dale up when he's healthy. So no, we will dig into, and we actually will be doing more on greenhouse gas measurement down the pike soon. So yeah, just continue passing the mic down the table here, and then it'll ping pong back to you at the other end.
Hi, my name is Mark Djukan. I'm a research intern at the Climate Institute. So I would like to comment on the profitability and technologies able of reducing actually black carbon, but also actually getting a profit for the one utilizing these technologies. One thing that you did not mention and which is currently being considered is actually energy recycling or cogeneration. In fact, in the US, there is a producer of coke and steel, for instance, ArcelorMittal from India, that has installed one facility in Chicago, which actually, by capturing waste heat from the process, produces 100 megawatts of electricity. Now, this is a technology with huge prospects. And if you think about it, a single producer could actually generate profits by utilizing it. And if you look at the example in Chicago, and this is coke production also, which is coke is a necessity in the steel production process. I believe that in China, the potential for reducing black carbon comes exactly from utilizing these kind of technologies in the coke production process. And this is especially if you consider that China is one of the biggest producers of steel in the world. So my question is, have you investigated these kind of technologies? And have you in general looked into the coke production in China or the steel industry in general?
Okay. Or do you know of someone who is? If you personally don't. Dennis?
I know that Danielle's colleagues have done that. So.
Yeah, no, Clean Air Task Force, I've been tackling them gently, and we're getting them online. Actually, Ming Song is going to come in May, but we can try to do something. I mean, but that's part of it, too. Sometimes the panelists I have here can't answer the questions, but any comments? Actually, but Ram, I wanted to ask you, I know that in India that you are involved in some kind of clean cook stove project?
Yeah.
Kind of get back, this question of profitability and whether people adopting it, anything to say with that project that links to this? But we won't someday. We'll talk afterwards. We will get this cogeneration thing going.
Yeah, teaming up with some NGOs and institutions in India, we have started a project first, trying to understand and measure how much climate warming comes from emissions from cook stoves. So we have taken a small village and started, just what finished baseline measurements of how much black carbon and other gases comes out inside the homes, outside, and then surrounding this area. And then we've been experimenting with 4 or 5 stoves to see which really cuts down and the black carbon. And we have picked one of them, and as we speak, this week that entire village we are replacing with cleaner cook stoves, to the extent we can say, and then we're going to make these measurements for another 3-4 months. And if we are on the right track, then we are going to go for funding where we will take an area of about 50,000 population, large enough region, and as I say, create a black carbon hole by cutting down all black carbon emissions, cleaner stoves, okay? We also changed the kerosene lamps to solar lamps in these villages because kerosene is source of black carbon. What we are planning is that monitor this region not only with in situ observations, we are using cell phones as a monitoring tool, developing new technologies, and follow this region from space, satellite. And the hope is I can come to a meeting like this and show how this village has changed, and then measure how much global warming have they saved. And my theoretical calculations so far, which you shouldn't trust, suggest that removing 1 ton of black carbon has the same effect as removing a couple of 2,000 tons of CO2. So the hope is, in terms of the financial question, if each villager can use cell phones to document what they have reduced, just imagine if there's carbon credit $30, $40 a ton. So 1 ton of black carbon, they'll get $80,000. And we are working with the Chicago Climate Exchange Commission. This was last year, and they estimated roughly each villager will get, if they can document directly, about 30 cents a day. For you and I, for us, it's nothing. But for a villager who's making to $2 a day, 30 cents a day is a huge thing. And I'm hoping that is what would sustain these cook stoves, because I'm always told, whenever I say cook stove, that's why I didn't talk about it, I know 100 cook stove program which failed. So I want to wait till I show if it can succeed.
Okay, actually, we got so many questions. Okay, I need super short. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, super short. I need a microphone in your hand, though. You need a microphone or no one will hear in Webland.
Dr. Ramanathan.
No, you need a microphone. Sorry. There you go.
Dr. Ramanathan. My name is Darwin Curtis. I wonder if you have concluded whether or not solar cooking has any application in the reduction of black carbon.
Okay, that's a good one. All right.
I'm glad you asked. You see, the name of my project is Surya. Surya in Sanskrit means sun. So, and that is what I was after, this parabolic stoves, not the photovoltaic, but parabolic stoves. So the first thing I learned when we started data collection is this village is that most of them, almost 90% of the villagers, they earn less than $2 a day, which means the women have to work. So they have to be in the field by 8 in the morning. So they cook between 5:30 to 7 in the morning, and then 5:30 to 7:30 in the evening, exactly when the sun is not there. So my first idea was shot down. But I still like the word Surya. We are keeping it. But what we are planning to do is introduce the solar cookers in communal cooking in village schools, because most of the kids go to school because the lunch is given free. So we're going to we will try to use the solar cookers still in government buildings and schools.
Okay. Ada, can you hand the gentleman next to Jacob? Sorry, don't.
Hello, my name is John Mitchell. I coordinate the Partnership for Clean Indoor Air. And I just wanted to say one thing about cook stoves. The partnership has more than 340 partners working in 115 countries. And we've talked about profitability, that our partners right now are doubling the amount of stoves sold more than every other year. One of the things that's holding them back is because the margin is so small, they don't get a chance to do a lot of marketing through TV and radio, which could greatly accelerate the amount of stoves they could sell. And I just say one other thing is that increasingly partners are starting to get money from the voluntary carbon market, and organizations are also looking at the CDM to get funding to enable them to expand their programs. And maybe because we've talked a lot about it, maybe sometime again in the future we could have a panel. We certainly have a few years ago on some work in China, so be happy to do that.
Huan Ying, warmly welcome you. I also am warmly. I've got to be honest. We can tackle them afterwards. Sorry, I try to start on time and end on time. What?
Giving us permission to tackle them.
You have permission to don't hurt them too much. They're very intelligent men, and they're doing good things to improve the planet and the health of everybody. But also want to thank all of you, clearly not just amazing, intelligent people up here, but out in the audience as well. A reminder is that on Monday, I have my gaggle of green lawyers from China coming, and they will be talking, some of them will also be talking about they're going to be talking about the role of lawyers in both the energy and pollution control arenas. It's a noontime meeting. I rarely feed you people lunch, so come if you want. And on Tuesday, screening at DC Environmental Film Festival, we've got a movie about the NGO Future Generations that's been sponsoring this Green Long March, and sometimes their topics have been climate. So again, thank you very much for coming, and we'll see you soon.